Well guys, it seems that Sony and Microsoft are locking in the specifications for Xbox Magnus and PlayStation 6, with the PS6 having a disadvantage in performance over the Xbox hardware. And as primarily a PC gamer, I have to say that this seems to be history repeating itself once again. With the previous generation, when we were learning about all of the leaks and the specifications of the hardware, it seemed that on paper, Sony has a disadvantage over the Xbox Series X consoles, but in reality when they came out, well, they were pretty much very close to one another, with the Xbox having advantages in some games, yes, in terms of resolution, sometimes it was vice versa, but this time around things perhaps are going to be more complicated. Because, for one, Xbox Magnus is almost certainly going to be more expensive, and you'll see why when we're looking through the hardware in just a moment. Secondly, both Microsoft and Sony will also be releasing other variants. For example, the PS6, yes, there's going to be a home console, but also, of course, that handheld. And I do suspect that the handheld is going to be extremely popular for Sony. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff to talk about here. So what I want to do, well, for one, I'm going to put my bloody glasses on so I can actually see worth a crap. And we're going to actually jump from this article to this article for a second, because Tweaktown do a really nice job. I'll leave a link to this in the video description. Anthony does a really nice job of just basically plonking down all of the specifications in an easily readable format. And long story short, you'll see that for we're going to cherry pick on a few of the specifications, and then we'll start filling in the gaps. So for one, both seem to be based on RDNA 5. Now, I'm sure that there's going to be some customizations. It's not just going to be the straight PC variants of RDNA 5, because Sony recently went on record and said that they want to tweak things for a console implementation. They've said this a couple of times, but I'm sure the base IP is going to be RDNA 5 based. Anyway, 68 compute units for RDNA 5 for the Xbox hardware. Meanwhile, it's going to be 52 to 54 for the PS6. Unfortunately, the clock frequency has not been decided yet. 2.6 to 3 gigahertz. Honestly, at this stage, I think clock frequencies are just... I think you can have a target, but whether it's hit or even surpassed, it's oftentimes you don't 100% know what the clock frequency is going to be, and this is, of course, even what we're talking about now with the clock frequencies of, let's say, Zen 6 for the PC. Anyway, continuing on, the TDP is estimated between 250 and 350 watts. The higher they go, in theory anyway, they'll be able to crank the clock frequencies up and so on and so on. But, of course, that also means you need more exotic cooling. It's possibly going to also depend on the quality of the chips they're getting. Allegedly, it's going to be based on the 3NM process. As for the CPUs, this actually gets a little hinkier. So, for the Xbox, we have 3 Zen 6 cores and 8 Zen 6C cores. Just to keep things really simple for the sake of this video, I've gone over what Zen 6 and, Zen 6C and all of that stuff is previously several times, but basically just think of Zen 6C as a denser, more power efficient core. There are some changes architecturally. Typically the C variants may have smaller caches or what have you, but basically it's just redesigned to be in a smaller environment. And most of the same instructions and that type of stuff goes one-to-one. So essentially they are almost identical in terms of the actual features. It's just that, they make some other changes along the way. Meanwhile, Sony have between 7 and 8 Zen 6C cores, and they have 2 Zen 6 LP cores. So Sony are going a very different direction to Microsoft, basically. They have the smaller cores and a couple of low power cores. And as for the memory, we're going to have an update to this in just a second. Oh, I should also mention there's 10 megabytes of L2 and 24 megabytes of L2, respectively, the PS6 and Xbox. Now, to my understanding, this has not been fully locked in yet. Moore's Law is dead said that he's estimating some of these specifications, including the cache, so this could change. Now, let's just briefly go over the memory. So we're going to actually do an update to this in just a second, but 160-bit bus and This is going to be 40 gigabytes of memory on this particular one with 640 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. Meanwhile, on the Xbox, there's a 192-bit bus with 48 gigabytes, and both of these are using GDDR7, which of course is the fastest memory you can currently get, unless you're talking about like high bandwidth memory or something like that. It's used on GPUs such as the NVIDIA RTX 5090 or the 5080 or what have you. Now, Kepler L2 is stating that he believes that now the hardware has been finalized. I will give an asterisk here. First of all, Kepler's had a pretty good track record. The asterisk is, though, that we don't know if there's going to be a redesign of the chip. We don't know if there's going to be something... Well, we may not know fully what's going on. Do you remember, if you're, like, old, like me, you might recall, and you're from Pepperidge Farm, you might remember the whole GitHub situation with the PS5 and the Xbox Series consoles. When those leaked, we didn't even think the PS5 actually supported hardware-based ray tracing, because the variant of the chip, I think it was like, you know, Ariel, Oberon, all this stuff, you remember that way back in the day, that actually was because the variant that had leaked, it was very early, and so at that point, the early chips that were shipping to developers, they literally just didn't have hardware-based ray tracing enabled on the chip, and then later variants, of course, added this. It was just that Sony could get their development kits early. This seems to be not the case this time around. It seems that Microsoft and Sony are roughly on parity, whereas beforehand, Sony basically went and got their kits out earlier than Microsoft, at least to my understanding. But again, we don't know what features will or will not be added. I'm sure there's a few things we don't know here or there. Anyway, it seems that respectively we have 30, 24, so the PS6 has 30 gigabytes of memory, 24 gigabytes of memory for the handheld, and the Xbox Magnus will have 36 gigabytes. That's actually a really big deal. That's a lot of additional RAM. What we've learned, of course, about the RDNA 5 based GPUs is they have all of this additional compression technology. I covered this just recently, but yeah, they're going to be able to compress data a lot more effectively. You can check out my previous video where AMD as well as Sony were talking about some of these features. The Radiance cores, for example, are going to probably be a really big deal for ray tracing. It seems that path tracing is going to be a very big possibility for the next generation of consoles. RDNA 2, which of course is powering the PS5 and the Xbox Series consoles, it does have ray tracing, but the RT cores are nowhere near as advanced as what we have with NVIDIA's RTX 20 GPUs, which came out roughly the same time period. So obviously, it's quite a big deal for AMD to be moving forward. RDNA 4 was a really big jump, and RDNA 5 is a really massive leap. And from everyone I've spoken to behind the scenes, RDNA 5 is going to be a really, really big deal. Sony, you can see here, they're talking around 1200 tops. That's and this is for AI. This is trillion instruct operations per second, and this, of course, is going to be massive for the next generation of hardware. Sony, of course, are leveraging PSSR on the PS5 Pro to some reasonable efforts, but honestly, PSSR certainly has some weaknesses here or there. I think it's going to be very interesting when they move to their next generation. They are obviously working with AMD, and there are a lot of very cool things that we have already seen, and there's some hints, like, for example, Project Redstone, where we're seeing things like neural radiance caching for path tracing, but I don't want to get super technical in this video. Kepler L2 also thinks that it's possible there could be a lower-end Magnus console, but so far there's nothing in the documents which actually demonstrates they will do this. I think it's going to be very interesting with Microsoft because, from what we can ascertain anyway from all of this, you know, all of these leaks, Microsoft almost seems to be going like a... It's kind of hard to... I don't know if you guys remember the Steam Machine approach that Valve tried, but it never really took off. It seems almost like they're going that route, albeit in a more consoleized form. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what Microsoft's marketing is for this, honestly. Because, yeah, the rumor is that the PS6 console can, of course, play PS5 games, but it can also play PS4 games. And as for the next generation Xbox, I imagine it will be able to play Xbox Series games quite well, and potentially Xbox One games and so on. Microsoft have done a really good job with the backwards compatibility of the Xbox hardware, so it's going to be really interesting. So anyway, if we go back just for a second, I want to just drag up history for a sec. So if we go back to the Xbox Series consoles, we can see here the difference in specifications between Microsoft's hardware, where we have 52 compute units, and the PlayStation 5, which is 36 compute units. But of course, the clock frequency, you've got, I'm just going to round here, you've got around 400 megahertz higher frequency for the PS5, which does use a variant of the Smart Shift technology. Basically, what this does is constantly shift the power between the GPU and CPU. This can happen multiple times per single frame of animation, so the clock frequency can vary a little bit here or there, but ultimately it is much faster than the Xbox Series consoles. With that said, Microsoft does have a memory bandwidth advantage with the Series X, and yeah, they also have way more T-flops. So ultimately speaking, with the PS5, one thing that they do have is fill rate, because you can see here, where is it? There we go, ROPS. So we have 64 ROPS for the Xbox console, and 64 ROPS for the PS5, so obviously the fact that they have a higher clock frequency, this means you get in turn higher fill rate for the PS5, which is a really big deal. So it's going to be very interesting to see how these nuances are for the next generation hardware. I'm actually really interested in the PS6 and the Xbox consoles, despite the fact that I'm primarily a PC gamer. And this is because when new hardware becomes more standardized, in other words, the consoles get in on it, it really does help. It's like, yeah, okay, Nvidia had already put out, cards like the RTX 20 series. I think when did RTX 20 come out? I think it was like September, October, something like that, for the 2080 Ti and 2080, something around there, 2018. So it's around 2 years prior to the consoles, and that was, you know, we start to see like ray tracing in games. Like, I think Shadow of the Tomb Raider got its patch in 2019, but there were a few games that did, you know, have obviously ray tracing support at the launch of Nvidia's, cards. But ultimately, it's been the last several years since the PS5 and the Xbox have released, where we started to see ray tracing become a lot more utilized. So I think that the next generation is going to be a really big deal, because I think it's going to standardize a lot of stuff. Nvidia are working on things like neural rendering at the moment, and I think ultimately speaking, we are on the cusp of a lot of stuff changing for graphics. Eventually, you know, the traditional graphics pipeline that we've seen is pretty much going to be going bye-bye, at least according to Nvidia anyway. They want everything to be done via AI. It's going to be a while, and I don't think that we're going to be seeing this with RTX 60 or even RTX 70, but eventually. But obviously, the fact that we have so much more power. So, what are my thoughts? Well, you know, when I was talking a lot to my sources, I was leaking all the specifications or the general, shall we say, targets of the PS6. I had mentioned that it did seem that Sony were really doubling down on AI. And I'm actually a little surprised that what I was hearing initially is Sony were going to be going for a much more expensive design, but maybe they pared it back, or maybe my info was wrong. But most of the other stuff that I was told were pretty accurate, so I wonder if they did decide, you know what, people just don't want to cough up this huge amount of money. I think Sony learned a lot of lessons for the PS3, quite honestly. And I also think that, quite frankly with you, chasing the power game is not necessarily the best approach for Sony. I think just getting a large install base is. And I think for a lot of people, like, the ecosystem and just having a good set of games is going to be really important. Maybe it's just me, and, you know, let me know in the comments below if you think differently, but this generation, I think, has been good in terms of hardware. I don't think it's like a bad generation or anything like that. I think the PS5 and the Xbox, I'm just going to use both interchangeably for a second. I think they've been very interesting hardware, but the way more RAM is obviously a massive big deal. The ray tracing has definitely been a really big deal, and the SSD, just the SSD alone has meant that developers have had a lot more freedom with the consoles. And so I think that this generation has been really helpful in that respect. But I think the PS6 and the next generation Xbox, whatever it ends up being called, I'm just going to call it Magnus, I suspect that they are going to really do everything that was originally what Sony and Microsoft had wanted to do with the Xbox Series consoles. The only thing is, of course, it's like, I've had developers tell me, like, because I was like, you know, kind of like, dude, what is going on with Unreal Engine? Not quite like that, but yeah, like, why is UE5 running like this? And they're like, well, you know, Epic and these developers, they're just using all of these features, but, you know, they're just really heavy on current hardware. So, wow, that's nice. I can't wait for UE6 to come out. I'm sure they won't botch the optimization. You know, it's kind of funny, but I am actually quite excited for the next generation. Obviously, for the PC side of things, RDNA 5 releases next year, so we should have a really good insight into the performance of the hardware and what it can be capable of for consoles. So yeah, RDNA 5 launches late next year for the PC, or should I say the second half of the year. And I suspect Nvidia are probably going to launch roughly the same time period for RTX 60. I don't think Nvidia are going to be going MCM for RTX 60. That's not based on sources. That's just pretty much, I just don't see it happening. I don't think they're ready to go MCM. Multiple dies, especially for the compute. Maybe they might, but I suspect they're going to just maintain a monolithic die and shrink down to like 2 or 3 nm. It seems that for AMD anyway, the compute die, that's going to be on the 2 nm process, but a couple of the other dies that make up RDNA 5, those are going to be based on like 3 nm if memory serves. So I think the media die and the active interposer, I think those are on 3 nm, and I think the main chip is 2 nm, but I don't remember the exact process. But anyway, yeah, so I'm going to be very interested. I'm not, like, I think with the next generation of hardware, I think it's too early to know exactly how powerful the PS5 is, PS6 is going to be versus the next generation Xbox. I suspect that Microsoft will have the hardware advantage simply because of the specifications look pretty big in terms of the difference. With that said, we don't know, one, all of the hardware features that both of them have, and two, we're not too sure yet about the clock frequency. And at the end of the day, this is all rumors anyway. Until Microsoft or Sony actually announces their hardware, nothing's official. With that said, let me know your thoughts and opinions on this, guys. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.